But right now, we go back to Lata, who is at the JP Morgan conference in New Delhi, and she has another guest with us. Lata, over to you.
Thank you very much. I have with me one of my favorite guests from JP Morgan, Sajjid Chinoy, the chief economist from JP Morgan India, is with us. Sajjid, always a pleasure.
Morning, Lata.
Well, you have been listening to a lot of policymakers throughout your conference. Tell us some key takeaways.
Well, very encouraged by what we've heard. Number one, there's clearly a very realistic assessment of what the economy is going through, which is always a very good starting point. They've been very responsive so far, and the sense we get is that there will be a continuing set of responses sector by sector until consumer confidence and business confidence is reversed. So I think what the government's hoping is, rather than a big bang announcement, it's the cumulative impact of all these announcements over time that will hopefully turn confidence. There were a couple of other important takeaways. One is that to ensure bond market fears aren't exacerbated, they will stick to the fiscal deficit target, which is admirable discipline, and also that they are at the point now where asset sales are imminent.
Okay.
So I think the combination of sticking to your deficit targets of bond markets can heave a sigh of relief. Front-loading or expediting asset sales, which gives you more fiscal space to spend later in the year, and continuing to do, cleaning out different sectors. I think hopefully those combination of things, along with better efficacy of monetary transmission, hopefully in the second half of the year, should augur for some cyclical pickup in the coming quarters.
Okay. What made you a little positive on asset sales?
Well, there's clearly a plan in place. So without going into more details, the government officials have said there's a plan in place. They understand the need to do that, because the greater composition of asset sales in your revenues for the same fiscal deficit target, the greater the growth impulse.
Okay.
And that's a point we must never forget, that the more asset sales you do, even if the fiscal deficit target is 3.3, because asset sales in a way count below the line, the fiscal impulse is actually greater. So this way you get a positive growth impulse without breaching the deficit target.
Okay. But did they say anything about strategic sales of key companies?
Yeah.
I mean, I know you're not the stocks guy for JP Morgan, but there was a buzz about BPCL.
Yeah.
So is there a strategic sale at all that you picked up?
Yeah, no, I think they didn't go into the details for good reason, because these are price sensitive. But I think the larger point was disinvestment and asset sales, front-loading expenditure by CPSEs must be the two-pronged approach to try and jumpstart demand in the economy.
Okay. One of the fears, and Sudipto Mundal spoke about it as well, when we told him about, government not having much space and government expenditure last year being very bad because of the election year, he said, you ain't seen no nothing yet.
Yes.
Saying that the second half of the current year, the government expenditure will be even less because of the tax shortfall.
Yes.
Your thoughts?
Well, there are some offsets here, so you're right. The tax numbers are a little bit sobering. The first 4 months, taxes have grown at less than 7%. The target for the full year is 18%. But remember, some of that is because tax rates have gone up, so it's not all buoyancy. So if there is a shortfall of 1% or thereabouts, the hope is 0.3 of that is made up by the extra RBI dividend, and hopefully you get a little bit more asset sales. So there will be some expenditure cuts, but remember, the budgeted expenditure growth is 20% this year. And I don't think the government has the absorptive capacity to even grow expenditure at that rate. So there'll be some natural savings from expenditure, and hopefully that, along with the RBI dividend, should mean actual expenditure cuts are not as acute as markets fear.
Okay, that's possible, at least not as acute as Sudipto Mundal fears. What's your own sense of the turnaround time for the economy?
It will take a few quarters for two reasons. The August data is still quite weak. When you look at the PMIs, exports, imports, non-food credit has slowed. Core inflation suggests pricing power is very weak. Some of this, I think, is sentiment that can come back quite quickly. For example, households are delaying purchases of cars because they are worried about the GST cut. So once those uncertainties are out of the way, hopefully there'll be some demand that comes back in the system. But one thing that we need to track is household debt. So individual debt has increased by 10% of GDP in the last 5 years, which means a lot of the previous consumption was financed by taking on debt or running down savings. In that environment, whenever you're hit by a shock, like we have over the last 3-4 quarters, the risk is households recalibrate future income expectations and become more risk averse. Okay. It's therefore important not to let the slowdown prolong for too long, because that could exacerbate this household risk aversion.
Let me persist with two positives that I
Sure.
got from different people. One, Pranab said, saying that he was extremely bearish on economic growth last year because he said there's not enough cash in the informal economy, a late effect of demonetization. Now cash has clearly returned to the cash-prone sectors. The other point which some others point out is that once the economy, the interbank system starts seeing surplus liquidity, usually in 9 months it recovers the economy.
Exactly.
Your thoughts?
Very much so. That monetary transmission in India is very lagged. So it's only 1 or 2 quarters from now that we'll see the full impact of the 110 basis points rate cuts and interbank liquidity. Typically, the way transmission will work is when credit growth slows, like it is now, and incremental credit deposit ratios begin to fall, then even though banks are risk averse, they really have no option but to lend rates
It's
and try and
begun
go
to
there.
fall already.
Exactly, which is what I said in August, non-food credit grew only 0.4% month on month. So transmission will happen. We just need to be patient. These things take a few quarters. Monetary policy is a blunt instrument. It acts with a big lag. So for me, the combination is if some confidence comes back, especially after this GST uncertainty goes away and people stop postponing expenditures, in the second half of the year, transmission gets better. Oil, thankfully, has not increased very sharply. And remember, globally also, 20 central banks have cut interest rates. And we're hoping that global growth stabilizes the second half, so it's less of a drag. So, let's look for positives where we can.
Okay. Yeah, that's what I'm trying to. What's your GDP number? When I last spoke to you was 6.4.
Yeah, the risks are meaningfully to the downside. I think we may well end up with a number closer to 6. But again, as policymakers have emphasized in this conference, let's not get obsessed with quarterly GDP prints. If the right actions are put in place over the next 2-3 quarters, 1 year from now, hopefully, we'll be in a much better place.
Okay. There is another interpretation that I got from some of the guests in JP Morgan. And this is an old interpretation which even, has been spoken about in the US. Are we measuring the wrong GDP? The GDP traditionally has been measured with cars. It is not measuring as much in cell phones. The weight given to electronic equipment, definitely smartphones, is less.
Yes.
Maybe people are using more services. OYO rooms perhaps are not there, but hotels are there. And hotels may be doing badly and OYO may be doing well. This is an argument we have heard even about the GDP in the US. The internet, so much is available to us, but that's not getting counted in GDP.
Right.
So are we angsting about GDP unnecessarily?
Yeah. Whenever there's large technological change, the worry is, are we undercounting productivity growth, or we aren't measuring it? This has been a quintessential problem. I would just say that let's not get obsessed with the GDP number, but it's undeniable we're in a slowdown, because look at all the other high-frequency indicators, right? Look at wage growth, look at profitability. Ultimately, those things must show up in other variables. And so the answer is always somewhere in between. That maybe things are not as bad because we're not counting all these new goods and services, but we're clearly in the midst of a slowdown. And if we're cognizant of that, we'll take the right actions to come out of it.
Okay, so the right action, that last question to you. What in October and what before the fisc ends from the RBI?
So we'd expect at least a 25 basis point rate cut in October. My own sense and preference is to do this in small increments, because strangely in India, you always want to keep the bond market wanting more. You'd end up getting more transmission if people think more rate cuts are coming. If you do a disproportionately larger cut, even though it's warranted given the economic situation, bond markets may take away from that, well, a lot of the space has been exhausted, not much is left, and the action is quite perverse, which is what we saw after the August policy. So my sense is that you do 25 in October, and the guidance should be that if more is needed, more will come. We saw that in the FOMC last night, where the Fed chairman clearly said if the economy goes off the rails, a larger sequence of rate cuts is necessary. I think that kind of guidance would be sufficient to get better transmission.
Okay. Thank you very much, Sajjid Chinoy. It's always a pleasure speaking with you.
Sure thing.
So, well, the big point is, yes, we may be undercounting the GDP, but then, you can't suddenly change it. We have to compare like to like. So there is a meaningful danger to his expectation of 6.4 for the current year, which is already so much less than the 6.9 of the RBI. Maybe we'll get a GDP closer to 6. Rate cuts on October 4th is a given. How much is the issue? Well, maybe we should see some growth cycle turning, perhaps by January. That's the hope the new year will bring. Back to you.
All right, Lata, thank you for that conversation. Well, that's some more perspective coming in from JP Morgan. Let's just pull up the IIFL Wealth stock, the wealth business that has demerged from IIFL Holdings. Remember, it's a three-way demerger. This is the wealth business, which the market has valued at 1260. There's going to be the financing business. The existing entity, which is called IIFL Holdings, will be known as IIFL Finance. And then there'll be the capital markets business in IIFL Securities, which will also eventually list. So that gets underway, and the market seems to be quite happy with the way it's shaping up. 1260 is what we are getting. Let's take a break on that note. We'll come back on the other side. The focus is going to be on the government's proposal to ban single-use plastic. What is that going to mean for some companies? Rajesh Bhatia of Uflex and Pankaj Podar of Cosmo Films joins in. They make material which goes into plastic packaging. We'll get some more perspective with the gentleman.